So first of all, thanks, Daniel, for joining in this conversation. So in your book, Richer and More Equal, you address the critical issue of wealth inequality and wealth accumulation. And first of all, wealth is, a key determinant of household well-being, is fundamentally different from income. And yet our understanding is, still quite limited and fundamentally, far less developed than what we know about income. And in your work, so that you highlight and you chose to highlight the positive side of wealth accumulation as something that boosts welfare in free market economies. But many economists, including myself, argue that extreme wealth concentration actually may also worsen other forms of inequality, limit social mobility, and even undermine, to some extent, democracy by giving billionaires too much political influences. And so things, that aren't really covered in your book. Another concern, actually, which you don't talk much about in your book, relates to how widening wealth gaps might hurt economic inefficiency or economic efficiency. And we all know that in an efficient market, capital should ideally be sort of allocated to the best able to use it productively. But when wealth is passed on dynastically through family, it doesn't always guarantee that it ends up sort of in the most productive individual's hands. And this, to some extent, could affect economic dynamism and growth. So could you talk about why you chose to focus more on the positives of wealth accumulation? And do you think concerns about wealth concentration are somewhat exaggerated, or are these issues we should take seriously into account? And what do you think about this idea that rising wealth inequality is somewhat undermining economic inefficiency?
Thank you for inviting me, and thanks, Salvatore, for these quite important questions. I mean, now you bring up several different topics, and we will I will come back to them a little bit, back and forth in this discussion, because maybe my answer or response right now will not be very structured. So, but you're right to the extent that I want to highlight the fact that wealth is kind of value. I mean, it's good that we make valuable things in society, so that we invent new stuff, new products or services that other people value so much that they want to pay for this out of their own pockets. So creating wealth, basically enhancing the size of the economic pie. I mean, creating welfare, creating jobs, paying taxes. This is the kind of the private activities that we are accustomed to associate with a good life and increasing life quality. So in that sense, wealth as such is something quite good. So having wealth generation, wealth accumulation, I think is a precondition for a good life. So this is a basic reason for why I want to highlight the positive aspects of wealth creation. I think when it comes to my book, I focus both on the accumulation of wealth, or the building of wealth, but also, of course, on the gaps or the distribution of wealth. And the challenge for society, of course, would be then how to combine these two things, where we want to generate wealth for production, for consumption, and so on. But on the other hand, also having differences within society, rewards for effort, and maybe also other aspects that you mentioned that would be contained to some extent to kind of capture the coherence, the need for people to be relatively alike, to generate deep stuff like trust and so on. So this is a challenge. There's not one answer. Of course, I think one of the conditional or the contextual aspects of my analysis is to look at the Western world over the past 130 years. I look at long time span of history, and as we have come along in this historical context, it's going to be within the realm of a liberal democratic market economy. So where in the best of worlds, we could say that freedom of signing contracts, the safeguarding of private property. We could think about entry rules and trying to prevent monopolies and so on. In that context, all of the stuff that comes about and is valued is kind of part of a spontaneous process where good ventures are getting valued, and bad ventures and risk taking may go bad, and people go bankrupt and so on. So within that context, I think wealth creation, even if it's like larger companies and big fortunes, is kind of a proof of people having done good things and having been rewarded for it. I mean, unlike, of course, oligarchs within other kind of political contexts where we have theft as being or corruption being, part of the channels for these kind of big wealth generation processes. So this is what I mean. I'll stop there. I mean, I'd love to come back to the stuff that you talked about with political power and so on. But this is the basic reason for why I think wealth generation is good, and just let me add that people generate new wealth, they build new wealth, come up with companies that become successful, does not mean that they have taken this wealth from someone else. So it's not a zero-sum game going on in the economy. I mean, when we look at the long historical time spans, this becomes obvious to anyone that the values in our economies today weren't like taken from someone in the past. They have been created because of the rewards that are out there in the private context, private sector, and expanded wealth and expanded opportunity. So this is why also we should think positively about these ventures. So this dynamic approach to the economy, that things are created, is also a little bit in contrast to some kind of ex-post economics thinking, like, oh, everything is there, let's tax it because money is there. I mean, it's not necessarily there if we bring on the wrong context, which we did in the socialist economies in the East and so on. So some of these things are what motivates me to bring up the positive aspects of wealth.
Thanks, Daniel. Perhaps, I mean, at least to my reading, there is one concern that you stress in the book that has to do with how rising wealth inequality affects perhaps equality of opportunity. In fact, there is a passage, a section of the book where you actually highlight that when wealth is concentrated across generation, it may sort of create problems for social mobility from a fairness perspective. It's somewhat troubling that family wealth can sort of have such a large impact on someone's chances of success in life. And in fact, you go on in detail about how inheritances play a big role in passing wealth from one generation to the other. But let me just pause a little bit more on some other aspect of your book.
Sorry, before, I mean, could we just stop by a little bit on so yeah, now I brought up the good things about wealth creation and like risk, taking and ventures and so on. But let me just be clear about this, some of these aspects of wealth inequality, I mean, we can come back to this once and again. But so, for example, the social mobility stuff that you mentioned, I think when we couple wealth holding and wealth inequality with other sectors, for example, when it comes to the educational system, if it gets too much of fee-based structures in education, access to education or access to high quality education, we create linkages between fortunes or money and the opportunities for our children for a good education, which makes wealth inequality problematic, where we would have differences in parental wealth ownership transmitting to opportunities for children's lifespans or life chances. I think this is an argument for having broad-based entry, maybe without much of private fees in the educational system. But the same could also be used for the healthcare system, where, I mean, the right to purchase high-quality healthcare is problematic. I mean, at least to some extent, there are bounds to how much society can subsidize. And in the political sector, let's think about, some countries in Europe, like Sweden, I think many Nordic countries, where we have rich people, and yet we don't think of these systems as highly corrupt. Instead, we have in the political system, built structures that kind of tries to safeguard the the politicians and the parties from too much of private money influences in terms of campaign contribution regulation, transparency rules, and so on. So in order to kind of think about some of these negative aspects of wealth inequality to society, let's try to think about fixing, maybe the educational system, not making it too prone to private money or even political parties, so on, so that we can try to separate, try to make wealth generation be as good and as efficient as possible on the one hand, and then try to separate it from those sectors that could make wealth inequality become a quite negative source in society. All countries don't manage to do this well, and we could always improve. But so there are cases where wealth inequality indeed does have these negative aspects on society. Why we also want to talk about that this kind of inequality can be problematic from a social point of view. Okay, sorry for
no, thanks for this. Thanks for this, Daniel. I don't think I'm going to sort of trivialize too much your book if I'm going to summarize it in this way, also because it's part of your title. So I think your book is really about challenging what you call the old narrative. The wealth followed this U-shaped pattern over the past century, peaking at the end of the 19th century, then dropping after the world wars, or during the world wars, and now returning to those high levels of the past. And instead of this old narrative, you've decided to focus on a different long-term view, arguing three main things, key aspects. So first of all, we are richer today than before. Second, wealth today looks very different from the wealth in the past. And three, there has been really a democratization of wealth, leading to a greater equality overall. So these, I think, are the three main aspects that you bring out in your book, which are very interesting, new reading of the data as well as the literature. And you also suggest, in passing, that sort of wealth inequality has been relatively stable in recent decades. So while I can see how these points have been overlooked in the literature and in the public debates, I find also, especially the last claim about stable inequality, a bit hard to accept, as you know from our conversation. So for one, while a sort of long-term trends are important, it's also true that recent data are showing greater wealth disparities in several countries, not everywhere, but in several countries, which has obviously big implication for people's well-being and policies today. And also, it seems to me that your overall conclusion seems to focus mostly on a few wealthy countries, but globally, wealth inequality has risen sharply in some places in other countries. So could you explain a little bit more the structure of your arguments and what the broader implications are?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, so the book is kind of set in one, to one extent at least, a very long historical analysis. So looking at today, comparing to the past, one analysis has been to basically compare it to the situation a century ago, 100 years ago, and then by any measures or standards, we are much more equal today than we were in the past, and the result has been is a huge wealth equalization, or a great wealth equalization over the past century. And in that perspective, so the recent changes or stability outcomes in the Western world, especially Europe, let's be clear about this, Europe and US follow a little bit of a different path over the recent decades. There's still, in the long-term perspective, the recent decades have been relatively stable. I mean, in fact, depending a little bit on where you look, but it's more or less a few percentage points to be compared to the huge drop in inequality over that long century. But that said, you're perfectly right that we've had observations of increasing wealth concentration or wealth inequality over the last decades, starting maybe from the 1970s, 1980s up until today. differs a little bit across countries. We have had fluctuations, and maybe there's been an increase during the 80s and maybe mid 90s, and then stability from the 2000s onwards. I mean, it depends a little bit. So I think, you know, facts should be on the table, and let's be clear about this. So I mean not to understate that increase. I mean, in fact, when we narrow in, I have graphs in the book that only look at the post 1980 period, and I think when we even narrow into the very top of the distribution, I think there is even a clearer trend of an increasing wealth share going to the very top over this past 40 years or something. I think that's something to be very clear about. To the extent, so the interpretation of that, I think I mean, let's be open about, we don't know really. I mean, I think, for example, the 1970s was an era of problems for Western economies. We basically had a backstop in our way of trying to direct the economy, having too many regulations, too high taxes. Many industries were taken out by international competition, and we needed to change this. And all Western countries realized this. And so what we saw in the 80s and 90s was kind of drops in taxation, reductions of top tax levels, fewer regulations, and what happens as a consequence was the higher growth, more initiative, more entrepreneurship, and yes, this created also new companies, more new fortunes, and also to some extent more wealth gaps. So I think much of this is a normalization or like a positive thing. I mean, just look at what we use in our everyday lives in terms of mobile phones or internet or streaming services and so on. Much of that is kind of the result. This is some of these global leaders that we really, you know, enrich our lives. But one also, you know, one reference point is also that, yes, wealth concentration may have increased, or the top 1% wealth share may have increased maybe 10%, 20%, or 30% since the 1980s. But during the same period, total wealth increase has been like 300%, or like maybe even more. It depends a little bit across the country. So we've generated enormous amounts of new wealth in our economies, and yet wealth gaps haven't decreased by any chance as much. And the reason is, as you mentioned, this fact that most of the wealth today, I mean, maybe 80% is kind of housing and mutual funds and pension funds, the stuff that people own and the normal wage earners sit on, or middle class people. So yes, I mean, we can talk about interpretation, and there are back and forth positive and negative aspects of stuff. And I think, by the way, having super successful entrepreneurs becoming super rich, or, you know, some big companies become successful, that's something that we have seen. But we also seen a lot of these companies actually going down. You know, Nokia, for example, the Finnish mobile phone producer, was a global leader in the early 2000s, and then all of a sudden iPhone came in, and you know, today Nokia is producing boots and car tires. I mean, there is a turnover, or like BlackBerry or whatever. I mean, there's like, this is a dynamic process, and whatever is going to be productive, you need to offer good services that people are willing to pay for. And so again, yes, we may have had more successful entrepreneurs becoming successful over the last decades, increasing wealth concentration. But over this era, middle class people have also experienced the highest real wealth growth they've ever seen in history. So this has been a very positive period from that perspective.
Thanks. And in fact, I mean, you know, just resting on your last statement here, which is essentially at the core of your analysis and your book, you essentially suggest that, you know, wealth is no longer concentrated solely in the hands of the elite, just to quote one passage from your book. And in fact, you sort of also quote at some point earlier work by Tony Atkinson, who sort of described earlier on this process of popularization of wealth. And you know, you dedicate a good portion of your book on the role of public and pension wealth, which is sort of my last question to you. And I think it's particularly important because, you know, you point out that the Social Security wealth, which are really some promises of future income to individuals and households, are not necessarily and usually just counted as part of the standard definition of wealth, and still they may play a huge role for household well-being. And sometimes people may not even realize that they're sort of sitting on this enormous pile of wealth. And what happens is usually when you take that into account in standard measures of wealth inequality measures may look less severe than in the absence of these assets. And I totally agree with you on the importance of this point, and the fact that also this point have been sort of largely under discussed in the public debate. That said, also myself, like many others, have had some hesitation when it comes to sort of including Social Security wealth in the measures of wealth inequality and concentration. Of course, it's a complex issue which raises a lot of important technical and conceptual points on which I would like to hear your thoughts specifically. And there are a couple of points I would like to raise in this discussion that weren't fully, in my opinion, addressed in your book. So first, the public pensions, so we're talking about the public assets here, not the private accumulation or in private personal retirement accounts. So public pension assets cannot be necessarily just transferred, used as a collateral, or fully controlled by the individuals like other forms of assets. And so if you are looking at wealth distribution from a perspective of a control over resources or power, then it might make sense to exclude these form of assets from the definition. But if the focus of the analysis, in my opinion, is on inequality in terms of lifetime well-being, lifetime welfare, then it's harder to justify leaving them out, since pensions sort of offer financial security and influence how people save in the future. And so that's the first point. So the second point is that many economists, including leading economists in the field, Emmanuel Saez, Gabriel Zucman, argue, for instance, that if we include Social Security wealth in the definition of wealth measures, then we sort of are compelled to include other forms of future government sort of benefits like Medicare, education spending for our children, and we should perhaps also take into account taxes payments in the future. And so, in a nutshell, it seems to me that this debate is not, it's not settled yet. And so I really would like to hear your take on this point.
Yeah, excellent description of the main issues on this topic, Salvatore. So obviously, so when we study wealth distribution in the developed countries, Western countries, this issue comes up all the time. And no matter how we go back and forth, we always have to think we're going to see a glass which is either half full or half empty. And so the pay-as-you-go pensions, so basically the promises of future pension income, they don't exist today. And even if we capitalize them, try to measure a wealth value today, which I do in one of the chapters in the book, becomes like a mental construct. So it's a very specific construct, and it's therefore not included in any of the baseline measurement or baseline analysis in the book. So this is why it comes up in chapter 8. So I totally take your point, and I think so when we think about middle class ownership, and we see that we have a fair amount of economically well-situated households having a good work. They live in rental apartments, and they live a good life, and they go to vacation every year and so on, and yet they have almost no private financial savings. Are they poor? Well, of course, in the European context, typically they're not super poor, but also they know that they have paid a fair amount of taxes, and so that their kids can get schooling, education, even university education without costing anything. I mean, they could get good health care and even elderly care without having huge costs on them because of the taxes they have paid, and they expect that this will happen also in the future when future wage earners will pay taxes and fund these systems. So this is kind of the construct that we are thinking about. And calling them super poor, and even poorer than many perhaps American middle class families that lack this kind of broad-based system. Or in fact, there is such a system also in the US, but maybe not as developed as in Europe, makes the comparison a little bit problematic. But equalizing the simulator, the computed present value of future income streams to money in the bank today it's a challenging approach, and I think we should take into account the uncertainty about the future wealth and so on. So which we can try to discount the value of the future money to make it less valuable for us today, and we can do it more or less ambitiously. But I think this is there is no clear answer. Martin Feldstein was one of the champions in approaching this concept of social security wealth, and it's important to think about, but it's not the truth, definitely not. And it's the other. So my point, my answer to that is basically let's see what it does to the distribution, and we see that it makes a relatively large impact. It makes wealth much more equally distributed than when we don't have it, because it's more correlated to incomes or earnings, which is more equally distributed than wealth. And it also doesn't change my historical narrative. In fact, it magnifies it. It even makes the great wealth equalization even more pronounced over time. So I think it's an even more positive story to the wealth narrative that I propose. On the other thing, you mentioned Emmanuel Zez, Gabriel Zugman, and some of these people who have contributed a lot to the wealth analysis, wealth inequality analysis. Why stop there? And I totally agree. Why stop there? We don't. There is no ex ante strong reason for stopping there. That's one of the reasons why this will only be an extra analysis. It's difficult really to draw the line. Pensions is the most important of these assets, or social security wealth, but where we could also add these other things. And I think I think what Emmanuel and Gabriel have done have also been to take this broad-based analysis to the income distribution study, looking at the distribution of national income. So distributing national income is kind of capturing the stuff that, the fact that we have generated a lot of income and resources in the economy that's not only visible on the individual tax returns. So how then is national income distributed, not only household income? So taking this to wealth is perhaps possible, but it's more difficult. And maybe at some point we will stop looking at wealth and instead go to income and broad-based measures of income to really come at the distributional outcomes that we are most interested in. So there is like no reason or no kind of clear solution for this uncomfortable feeling that we have. I'm just proposing these different empirical approaches and then see what happens. But at least it's what comes out is that the market economies of the West have generated enormous wealth and resources that has been directed to normal people, ordinary people, lifting the bottom of the distribution. And this is what kind of explains the equalization, not by destroying the capital in the top or like having capital taxes. So this is, I think, one of the main conclusions that we need to take home.
Thanks, Daniel. You're raising a lot of sort of thought-provoking questions. So another one that you're raising, and I think is fascinating, is where in the book you start talking about household indebtedness, and you mention how debts play a crucial role in people's financial lives, in somehow also helping them to make sort of timely investments in things like housing and entrepreneurship, and therefore it can actually be a powerful tool for building up wealth. And this may also resonate with the idea of taking out a mortgage to buy a home. And so, on the other hand, on the flip side, over indebtedness can also be a big issue, making households more vulnerable, even creating financial risks on a larger scale. And like we saw on the Great Financial Recession, which was fueled, after all, by a debt-driven housing bubble. So it also bring up, I think, an interesting point when it comes to measuring wealth, and people like us are sort of thinking about these questions. And because studies that focus on wealth distribution and wealth concentration usually focus on concepts of net wealth, so net worth, summing up all the assets, financial, real, and subtracting all the liabilities, which can put somehow people with a lot of assets and but equally large indebtedness and liabilities in the same category of people with very little wealth and no debt. And so, making sort of masking real differences in wealth holding. And so also making the comparison of ranks of individuals in the wealth distribution particularly challenging. So could you share your thoughts on these aspects, and how do you see debt fitting into the broader picture of wealth inequality?
I mean, this is quite interesting. Looking at the wealth inequality literature, which I've been a part for many years, it struck me when writing the book that the issue of debt has not been discussed that much. It's kind of always part of measuring wealth or net worth. Yet when looking at debt, I mean, it's been typically looked at by macroeconomists and how we were prone to financial crisis and so on. There is one, and I think this is something that we need to improve on. And as you said in the beginning, debt is a great thing in total. I think it enables us to do stuff that we otherwise would not have been able to do. I mean, we could be for studying at university, buying a house, obviously, and so on and so forth. So I think the better we have been to lend in the financial system, the more we've been able to have debt in the economy. We see upgoing in trends in all the kind of debt income ratios and so on. And of course, this within the private sector or like a realm of private contracting, the borrower and the lender should always try to really come along in the terms, and then there is risk assessments and so on. And of course, at societal level, the bank sector is specific, so we also, from society's point of view, need to have extra regulation of all of this. As for the over indebtedness, yes, I think nothing with over in it, the word over it is good. I mean, it's by construction. I mean, we don't like to be over indebted or over, and I think there is an exposed aspect of this. So it's a risk taking, and then or like a little bit of risk or uncertain future, and then things come out badly, and we go bankrupt, or like we have larger debts than we can pay for, or we have an income shock. That's handleable. I mean, this is how economies work, but there's another aspect, which is the concrete link to inequality, which Robert Frank at Cornell University has talked about when it comes in his books, like, for example, Falling Behind or Luxury Fever, where people try to consume or buy stuff in order to catch up with richer people, and then taking on too large debts for them to bear, but they are seeking status. This creates instability, and maybe the people in the middle class get more prone to income shocks because of the rising wealth gaps or income gaps, and the mechanism or the channel is by increasing indebtedness. Yes, this is problematic, and I think I think we should be aware of this. We should regulate that from the banking sector, but I think it's like let's try to be very pragmatic about this. Wealth inequality then will be what it is. But you mentioned this thing about measurement, gross wealth and net wealth. This is important to keep in mind because it matters for the ranking and also for the analysis of having zero net wealth holders, some of them have no assets and no debts, and some of them have large assets and large debts. Of course, this is going to be important for our understanding, but it also emphasizes the kind of the role of the life cycle in wealth. So typically, it's young people in the bottom of the wealth distribution, and people with income and promising careers, they can take on large debts because this is something that allows them to buy stuff or invest in stuff. So in fact, what this also does is to point at the role of income. I think the role of income is perhaps the most expressed when it comes to the role of indebtedness, or or like debt in general, that we need to have incomes to service our debt. Or debt obligations. This is why also then labor market policies and so on is very, or like having, fighting unemployment and so on, is the key to help out in terms of the debt structures, rather than trying to reduce the debt as such. I think at least this is some way of thinking of it. But then at least balance sheet analysis, wealth analysis, then contributes to this by coupling it to the incomes.
Thank you, Daniel. This has been a fascinating conversation. Thanks so much for sharing your thoughts with us. And thanks for answering all these long questions of mine.
Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for these very intriguing questions, Salvatore. And it was great discussing with you.